Ever felt invisible in your own home? I have. They say you don't really know a person until life hands you a storm, and you watch who brings you an umbrella and who stands under theirs, pretending not to see you drowning. I wasn't expecting riches. I wasn't even expecting love in the kind that sweeps through rooms with roses and loud declarations. I just wanted someone who wouldn't flinch when things got heavy. But instead, I got a man who called me poor, not just in money, but in spirit. The day I needed him most, he looked at a $50,000 medical estimate and told me to be realistic. But illness doesn't care if you're realistic. It only cares if you're ready. And I was ready, just not in the way he imagined. Because what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had inherited more than just genes and grit. I had inherited a name, a trust, a legacy. And when the day came, it wasn't me who was bankrupt. It was him. This isn't a revenge story. It's not even a warning. It's just what happened when silence met an empire. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so now. It started with a flutter. A strange, barely there sensation just beneath my ribs, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. I paused mid-laundry, my hand hovering over a damp shirt, and waited for it to pass. It did, quickly. So I kept folding, kept moving, because that's what women like me do. We power through things we don't understand until they make themselves undeniable. That night at dinner, I mentioned it, casually, with a laugh, like it was more amusing than alarming. He didn't even look up from his phone. "You probably just need to eat better," he muttered, scrolling. I nodded. Of course. Just food. Just tired. Just something small. I swallowed the rest of the conversation with my rice. But the flutter came back. Then came the pressure. Then the dizzy spells. Short, sharp moments where the room spun, and I'd have to grip a chair to steady myself. Each time, I told him. Not with drama. Not with desperation. Just in the way you tell someone who should care. He would nod. Sometimes say, "You worry too much." I stopped mentioning it after the 5th time. It's strange how silence starts, not with a decision, but with exhaustion. You tell someone your pain enough times, and when they treat it like background noise, you eventually stop speaking. You start wondering if maybe it really is in your head. Or worse, that it doesn't matter enough to make anyone pause. I booked the doctor's appointment myself. He didn't come. Said he had a meeting. I didn't argue. I didn't expect him to come, really. But something about hearing him confirm it made my chest feel heavier than the symptoms ever had. So I sat in that cold room alone, listening to the doctor's tone shift from casual to cautious. Words like testing, referral, and urgency were tossed between polite phrases, and I nodded as though I understood. When I got home, he was in the garage waxing his car. I stood at the door for a second too long before he noticed me. He didn't ask how it went, just handed me a receipt and asked if I could file it. Not for the doctor, for a part he'd ordered online. The flutter had turned into something more by then. Something with weight. Something I felt when I climbed stairs or stayed up too late. But what hurt most wasn't the physical ache. It was watching someone you share a bed with act as if your health was a side note in their day. I started sleeping earlier and waking up earlier, just to have space where I didn't feel invisible. The distance between us wasn't marked by arguments, but by absence. A slow, quiet detachment. He didn't notice the way I winced when I laughed. He didn't notice I'd stopped laughing altogether. It was a Saturday, the kind that begged for something light. I was feeling a little better that morning, less dizzy at least, and decided to use the small burst of energy to walk through the local artisan market. Not because I needed anything, but because sometimes being around beauty helps you remember you're still part of it. There was a handmade leather journal that caught my eye. Soft brown, rough-edged pages, with a clasp that reminded me of something my grandfather used to carry. I held it longer than I meant to, tracing the stitching, the quiet craftsmanship of it. It was $85, not cheap, but not impossible. When I showed it to him, later that evening, he laughed. Not a belly laugh, not even a surprised one. Just that flat, dismissive scoff that people make when they've already decided something isn't worth thinking about. You? You're not the rich type, he said, eyes not even on me. I blinked. Not because I disagreed, but because something about the way he said, "You" made it feel final. Like he wasn't just talking about my wallet, he was talking about my world, about where I belonged in it. I set the journal on the table and didn't speak for a while. He continued scrolling, sipping his soda, and clicking the remote, normal things. Comfortable things. Meanwhile, I sat with a truth I hadn't expected to hurt. That in his eyes, I would never be someone worth more than what I brought home every 2 weeks. It wasn't that I needed to be rich. It was that I wanted him to believe I could be. Or at the very least, that I was already valuable in ways that had nothing to do with the numbers in a bank account. But he had already placed me in a box. One lined with lowered expectations and quietly locked doors. It wasn't the first time I'd felt it, but it was the first time he said it out loud. A week later, he bought a smartwatch for himself. $600, no hesitation. Said he needed it for efficiency. I nodded, smiled even. I had learned by then not to make comparisons. Not out loud, anyway. But in the quiet of my mind, I kept a list, not of purchases, but of patterns. I had never asked him to make me rich, but I started to realize how uncomfortable he became when I dared to want something slightly outside of what he thought I deserved. He wanted me to be grateful, grounded, dependent. So I started dreaming in silence. I stopped pointing out the things I loved, and I stopped expecting him to see me as anything more than a budget line. That was the moment I began saving something he never saw, a piece of myself. And someday, he'd learn that not the rich type had less to do with bank accounts, and everything to do with how small he'd always hoped I'd stay. The envelope came on a Wednesday. Not the kind of mail you toss aside with flyers or fold into bills to be sorted later. It was thick, labeled urgent. The kind of envelope that makes a difference. Inside was a statement from the specialist. $50,000 for the full treatment plan. Not cosmetic, not optional, not someday. This was the line between managing my illness and letting it manage me. I stared at the number first, then at the words around it, then at the doctor's handwritten note clipped to the back, the one that read, "Time sensitive. We recommend immediate action." I waited until dinner. He had just finished bragging about how he might trade in his car for something newer, something flashier. The timing felt cruel. Still, I handed him the envelope with calm fingers and a racing heart. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the page as if it were an inconvenience. When he reached the number, he leaned back. "This is insane," he said. 50,000? For what? Some extra tests and checkups? They always try to scare people with big numbers. I said nothing at first. Just let the silence sit with us. Then I said, "It's not optional. This is the next step." He shook his head, already pushing the envelope back toward me. "No way. That's not smart. We don't have that kind of money just sitting around for something that might help. We don't have." I wanted to ask who he meant because I had quietly saved, invested, planned. I hadn't told him, but I had my own resources. I wasn't asking him to pay for everything. I was asking him to care enough to be in it with me. "Can you co-sign?" I asked softly. "Just for the hospital's sake. I'll handle the payments." He didn't even pretend to think it over. "I'm not tying my name to a medical debt. "That's not how I do things," he said, turning his attention back to his plate. "You always find a way to make things bigger than they are." I looked at him then, really taking in his appearance. The man I'd once believed would fight for me now couldn't even sign a paper. Not even when it meant I might live longer. Live better. Heal. $50,000. That was the price tag. But really, it was never about the money. It was about what you're willing to risk for someone you love. And in that moment, I learned that love, for him, had limits. Lines drawn in ink. Boundaries outlined in financial logic and self-preservation. So I folded the envelope, placed it back in my bag, and said thank you, not for helping, but for showing me exactly where I stood. I slept on the edge of the bed that night, not because he pushed me there, but because something in me couldn't lie beside a man who'd already decided I wasn't worth the cost. She never said it unkindly. My mother had a way of wrapping warnings in warmth, like she didn't want to bruise me with truth, only offer it gently, like an open palm beneath a falling glass. "Be careful with men who only count what they give," she said once, while we were shelling beans on the back porch. "They'll never see what you carry." I must have been 17, maybe younger. I remember laughing, saying something like, "You mean like Dad?" She didn't laugh, just kept shelling, quietly, as if I'd pointed at a wound that never really closed. Years later, I told myself I'd chosen differently. My husband wasn't loud. He didn't hit, didn't drink, didn't vanish for days like my father once did. I thought that meant I had won, that I'd broken the pattern. But now, with a folder full of unpaid bills and a silence between us that grew heavier by the hour, I realized I'd only chosen another version. A quieter one. A man who never left the house but left the room emotionally every time things got hard. My mother used to tell me that some men will love you for how little you ask. The less noise you make, the more peaceful they'll claim you are, even if you're bleeding inside. "He doesn't fight with you because he doesn't see you," she once said when I called her in tears during our first year of marriage. "He only loves the parts of you that make his life easier." I told her she didn't understand him. She just sighed. That long, tired kind of sigh that mothers reserve for daughters who still believe they know better. I remembered that sigh now, lying in a bed beside a man who couldn't sign his name to my survival, a man who loved the version of me that didn't cost him anything. The woman who cooked quietly, smiled on cue, and didn't mention her heartbeat skipping or her hands trembling over the stove. But that wasn't who I was anymore. Sickness doesn't ask for permission to change you. It rewrites your body, your priorities, and your patience. And mine had been rewritten more times than I could count. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked out into the dark. The moonlight pressed faintly against the curtains, soft and still. I could almost hear my mother's voice in it. "Don't let your silence be mistaken for approval," she once whispered as she combed my hair after a heartbreak. "One day, he'll believe you like being invisible." I didn't argue with her back then, and I didn't now. Because this emptiness beside me, this ache he didn't want to name, wasn't just about him. It was about me. And all the warnings I had folded neatly in my heart, just to prove I didn't need them. Turns out, I did. It was just after midnight when I woke up gasping. Not the kind of gasp you release after a bad dream, but the kind your body forces out when it's begging for air. My chest felt like someone was sitting on it. My hands were numb. There was a ringing in my ears so loud it felt like my own body was trying to warn me from the inside out. I reached for him, not out of instinct, but hope. The hope that maybe, even at a distance, he would feel this moment. Perhaps he would wake up and realize something was wrong. That maybe love, even tired love, would stir for the woman next to him, struggling to stay alive. He didn't move. I whispered his name. Still nothing. I sat up, trembling, trying not to panic. Panic would make it worse. I had learned that much. I counted my breaths, slow and shallow, trying to stay within the edges of control. My phone was on the nightstand. I reached for it, nearly dropped it, then finally dialed the nurse line from the specialist's office. My voice shook as I described what I was feeling. She told me to go in immediately. That word stuck with me. Immediately. I stood, my legs barely holding me, and walked slowly to the closet to get my coat. Still, he slept. Peacefully. No stirring. No questions. No, "Are you okay?" Not even the rustle of sheets. I looked at him one last time before I left the room. He looked so calm, so unaware, like the world wasn't cracking open inside the woman he shared a bed with. I drove myself to the ER. I didn't cry on the way. I was past crying, past begging for presence. What settled in my chest, tighter than the pressure I'd woken with, was the clarity that I was deeply, terrifyingly alone. In the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and questions, I answered every nurse politely. I told them I came by myself. I didn't say I had someone at home. I didn't want to explain why he wasn't there. I didn't want them to look at me with pity. By dawn, the immediate danger had passed. I was stable enough to go home, though more tests would be scheduled. The nurse asked if anyone could come pick me up. I shook my head and said no. Not because no one could, but because the one who should have didn't know I'd ever left. When I walked back into the house, the coffee pot was already brewing. He was in the kitchen, scrolling on his phone, in the same clothes he'd worn the night before. He looked up. "Morning," he said casually. "You're up early." I stood there, keys still in hand, heart raw from everything he hadn't noticed. And I realized then, some goodbyes don't happen with words. Some happen on the edge of pillows, in the space where someone could have turned toward you, but didn't. The scent of new leather hit me before I saw the car. It was parked in the driveway when I got home from a follow-up appointment, the kind that left you with more questions than answers. The doctor had said words like, progressing, and aggressively. I had nodded, clutching the folder of prescriptions and instructions like it was armor. But no paper can soften the weight of hearing that your lungs are struggling to remember how to hold life. He met me outside, beaming, keys in hand like a boy with a new toy. "You're not going to believe the deal I got," he said, unlocking the doors with a tap. The lights blinked at us like applause. It was sleek, dark gray, the kind of car that turns heads at red lights. He opened the passenger side for me, grinning widely. I stepped in because I didn't have the strength to explain how my chest was tight and my ribs were aching. I didn't want to dampen his joy. He showed me the features: the sunroof, the heated seats, the built-in navigation. He discussed horsepower and fuel efficiency, and how the dealership practically begged him to take it off their lot. I listened, but all I could think about was the oxygen tank the doctor said I might need if things kept getting worse. I hadn't told him that part. I hadn't told him that some nights I sat upright on the couch just to keep my lungs from collapsing into panic. That I counted my steps around the house like a frail secret. That I sometimes rehearsed how I'd call for help if I couldn't speak. I didn't say a word. He drove us to dinner that night, to celebrate. We sat in a booth near the window while he talked about the color options he'd almost picked. I pushed food around my plate and smiled at the right times. "You okay?" he asked halfway through his steak. "Just tired," I said. He nodded. "You should really take it easy. Stress makes things worse." I almost laughed, but I didn't have enough air in my chest to waste. That night, I stood in the garage after he went to bed. I ran my fingers over the hood of the car, cool, smooth, untouched by the weight that lived inside our home. It was strange how something so beautiful could feel like a betrayal, how it could sit there so silently while I gasped for air 2 rooms away. He had bought a symbol of movement, of arrival, of progress. And I was still praying to wake up with breath in my lungs. It wasn't the car that hurt. It was that he could see himself worthy of luxury, while seeing me as an expense. And somewhere between the down payment and my prescriptions, I realized he had already made his choice. He would invest in what moved him. And I was no longer on that list. The question wasn't loud. He didn't shout. He didn't even look up from his laptop. But somehow, those 7 words pierced deeper than any argument ever could. Why would you even need that much? I had rehearsed my ask carefully, in a soft tone. Clear explanation, no emotion, just facts, the way he preferred things. I sat on the edge of the armchair, medical folder open in my lap, bills paper-clipped neatly and in order. I'd even highlighted the sections that showed the urgency, the necessity. I didn't want to seem desperate, just responsible. "I'm not asking for all of it," I said. "Just help with a portion. A bridge, that's all. I'll cover the rest from my savings." He blinked slowly, then looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. 50,000 is already ridiculous, but even 20? He scoffed. That's a year of college, a small house in some states. I smiled, not because it was funny, but because sometimes the only way to keep from breaking is to pretend you're not standing on the edge of yourself. "This is my health," I said, my voice low. He waved a hand, dismissing both the statement and, it felt, the reality of me. "People live with stuff every day. You're acting like this is a death sentence." I didn't have the energy to argue with someone who hadn't been there at 3 a.m. when my breath caught and the room spun like a carousel I couldn't step off. I didn't remind him that I had driven myself to the hospital alone, that I had filled out forms with shaking hands and smiled politely to strangers while trying not to collapse. I just looked at him, really looked. The man I married had ambition, confidence, and a plan for every situation, except the ones that required him to be soft. He could calculate interest rates and compare car features, but he couldn't sit beside me long enough to understand the fear of not waking up the next morning. That kind of math didn't add up for him. I was too expensive, too complex, too human. He closed his laptop. That was his way of ending conversations he didn't like. "Maybe you should look into grants or something," he offered as he stood up. "Church fundraisers. There are programs for people in your situation." People in your situation. As though I'd wandered into this illness. As though I'd chosen it. He left the room, and I sat there, staring at the envelope in my hands. Still warm from the heat of my palms. Still full of hope I hadn't yet learned how to bury. I folded the papers slowly, put them back in the folder, slid it under the cushion of the armchair like a secret I was no longer willing to share. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just sat there, breathing quietly, because apparently, even that was asking for too much. The letter came in a cream-colored envelope, no return address, just my name written in the delicate handwriting I hadn't seen in years. I almost didn't open it. It arrived tucked between medical statements and pre-approved credit card offers, as if it too had forgotten its importance. I recognized the handwriting before I saw the signature. Aunt Louise. She wasn't the loud kind of family. She didn't bake cookies or attend Sunday dinners. But she saw me. Even when I was a child, trailing behind adults who talked over my head, she would crouch down and ask me real questions with space for honest answers. She had been quiet since her diagnosis 2 years ago. We exchanged Christmas cards. One phone call that ended too quickly. And then, silence. I hadn't known how bad it had gotten. I hadn't known she was gone. Inside the envelope was a letter, folded once. No fluff, no flowery sentiments. Just Louise, direct, thoughtful, and sharper than people gave her credit for. If you're reading this, I'm gone. But I didn't forget you. I've watched you from afar. I noticed how you consistently chose smallness to make others feel comfortable. I know what that costs a woman. This is my gift to make sure you never have to do that again. The rest of the letter was legal language, instructions, names of law firms, trust documents. She had left it all to me. The house in Vermont, the rental properties in Atlanta, the silent shares in a software company she'd invested in before anyone had heard of it. It wasn't just an inheritance. It was an empire. And I had known none of it. She had built it quietly, just like I had tried to survive, with dignity, with restraint, and with no need for applause. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling in my hands, as the weight of her belief in me pressed harder than the sickness ever had. I looked up and saw him through the window, rewashing his new car and polishing something that had already gleamed yesterday. A man so obsessed with appearances, he never thought to ask what I kept hidden in my heart, or my name. He had once told me I wasn't the rich type. And yet here I was, holding proof that someone saw value in me so clearly, they'd entrusted a legacy into my hands. I didn't run to tell him. I didn't wave the papers in his face or yell from the porch like in the movies. I just folded the letter, placed it in the drawer beneath the spare table linens, and smiled to myself. There's something holy about being underestimated, something powerful about being thought small and discovering you were never meant to be. I didn't need him to know what I had. Not yet. Because this wasn't just money, it was the return of everything I had been told to shrink. And I was done shrinking. There are things a woman learns to keep sacred, like peace, like silence, like knowing something he doesn't. After Aunt Louise's letter, I sat with the truth for days. Not just the numbers, though they were staggering. Not just the assets, though they were many. What sat heavier than anything was the permission it gave me. Not just to live, but to choose how to live. I could have told him that night. Could have interrupted one of his rants about gas prices or business deals he didn't really understand. Could have said, "Actually, I now own more property than your entire friend group combined." But I didn't. Because what I had wasn't a rebuttal. It wasn't revenge. It was mine. And I had learned, slowly and painfully, that some men don't handle a woman's strength with care. They don't know what to do with the power they didn't grant you. They shrink in its shadow. So I kept it quiet. I signed what needed to be signed, hired a discreet and kind financial advisor who met with me at a cafe on the other side of town. I filed documents, opened new accounts. I was careful, deliberate. Not because I was afraid, no, but because I had no interest in defending what was never his to question. I remembered the night he told me I wasn't the rich type, the way his eyes glossed over as if my future had already been written in permanent ink. And yet here I was, slowly building a portfolio in his blind spot. I invested in 2 more properties, quietly, 1 duplex, 1 small commercial space, both already generating income. I didn't need to brag. The checks came regardless. And the strange part? He didn't notice a thing. Didn't ask where I disappeared to on Thursday afternoons. Didn't question the manila folders that lived in my tote bag now. Didn't wonder why I suddenly stopped reacting when he talked about the cost of things. He liked the sound of his own voice too much to hear the shift in mine. There's a kind of joy in quiet wealth. A kind of dignity in knowing that you could correct someone's assumptions, but choosing instead to let the truth wait until it's ready to be seen. He still complained about bills, still asked me to be practical, still made me feel like I was lucky just to be tolerated. But I was no longer sitting at that table as a beggar. I was an empire in soft shoes. And while he held on to the illusion of control, I was building a world he wouldn't be invited into, not because I was cruel, but because he never cared to knock. Some people don't hear you until the silence is louder than anything you've ever said. And I had learned the beauty of quiet thunder. I didn't need to tell him I was worth 2 million. Eventually, the world would whisper it for me. She didn't recognize me at first. Not the doctor, I mean the receptionist. I had called ahead, asked to speak to the billing department, and used a name they hadn't heard before. My maiden name. It felt strange on my tongue, like an old song you forgot you still knew. I told them I was a friend helping with expenses. The patient stated that he didn't want to delay treatment due to the cost. They agreed, of course, that I wanted everything handled privately. Money has a way of smoothing conversations. So I came in with a checkbook, wrapped in a scarf, sunglasses over tired eyes, and I wrote the full amount. Not the deposit, not a payment plan, the whole $50,000. The woman at the desk blinked at the number, then back at me. I smiled softly, said it was important. She nodded, her eyes lingering like she wanted to ask more but knew better. The doctor came out by chance, walking past the glass window just as I was leaving. He paused, tilted his head. "Do I know you?" he asked gently. I shrugged. "Not really," I said. "But thank you for what you do." He gave me a polite smile and went back inside. He didn't know I was the woman who'd sat in his office 2 weeks ago, small and quiet and anxious about every dollar attached to survival. He didn't know I was the one who had said, "I'm not sure we can afford this," while clutching the paperwork like a lifeline. Back then, I'd looked down when I said it. I had felt the weight of lack, the shame of needing more than I thought I deserved. But today was different. Today, I chose not to be seen. Not because I was hiding, but because I wanted healing more than credit. The treatment would begin next week. There would be pain. There would be recovery. But there would also be breath. And that, to me, was wealth. I could have gone home and told him everything, watched the disbelief flash across his face, listened to the fumbling of questions about where, how, and when. But I didn't. I let him come home and complain about traffic. I let him discuss interest rates and a new cryptocurrency app he was considering trying. I let him live in his world, untouched by mine. He didn't ask about my appointment. He didn't ask if we'd made a decision. And I no longer needed him to. I went upstairs that evening and stood in front of the bathroom mirror. I took off my scarf, ran my fingers through my hair, and whispered to my reflection, "You did it." Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the girl inside me to hear it. Because that girl, the one who once asked for help and was met with silence, had finally saved herself. And she did it without asking for permission. I didn't wear anything fancy. Just a navy cardigan, soft jeans, and the flats with the worn sole I never bothered to replace. I didn't need to look powerful to be it. That was something I had only recently come to understand. The receptionist recognized me this time. She smiled, a little more warmly than before, like she'd figured out something unspoken. "Are you here to speak with billing again?" she asked gently. I shook my head. "Number just here to finalize the file." They brought out the paperwork. A thin folder with my name, medical codes, and a yellow tab marked "Paid" in bold. The doctor had written a note on the last page, stating that he was glad I could move forward, that treatment would begin the following week, and that he hoped I was in a better place. He didn't know how right he was. They handed me a receipt for my own records. I took it, folded it neatly, and tucked it into my bag like it wasn't the most expensive piece of paper I'd ever held. There was no applause, no grateful nurse running after me. Just a quiet transaction, just dignity in motion. The nurse on duty, young, maybe fresh out of school, glanced at me with soft eyes. I could tell she didn't know the full story, but she knew enough to understand that something had shifted. There's a way people look at you when you're not asking anymore, when you're not waiting for anyone to save you. On my way out, I paused by the water fountain, not because I was thirsty, but because for a moment, the weight of it all caught up to me. This was the cost of healing, not just the money, but the quiet battles no one saw. The decisions made in bedrooms and bank accounts. The tears that dried before they reached anyone's shoulders. As I pushed open the clinic door, I felt the spring air hit my face. Clean, crisp, like the first breath after a long winter. He didn't know I was here. He thought I was running errands, maybe grocery shopping, maybe at the pharmacy, trying to figure something out. He still believed I was waiting. Let him, because this wasn't about proving a point anymore. It wasn't about teaching him a lesson. It was about reclaiming something he never saw slipping from my hands. I didn't walk out that door angry. I walked out free. And when I got in my car, I didn't cry. I just stared ahead for a long moment, whispered, "Thank you," to a God who never needed me to scream to be heard. And then I drove home. Calm, whole, paid in full. He started leaving the lights on in the hallway at night. Not because I asked. He never asked me if I was afraid. But I could tell he'd decided I wouldn't be here much longer. There was a strange tenderness in the way he tucked blankets around me now. Not love, not an apology. Just comfort, like you'd offer someone who wasn't going to stay. I let him believe it. He still thought I was dying. It was in the way he watched me eat, measuring every bite, as if he were mentally noting what I used to enjoy. He started bringing home things I hadn't asked for in months, my favorite tea, and the soft mints I used to keep in my purse. A quiet inventory of memory before it disappeared. And yet, he still hadn't asked me how I was feeling. He asked about it. "Did you sleep? You need anything?" But never. "What did the doctor say?" Never. "What's next?" He didn't want to hear it. He preferred the version of the story where I faded away gently, where no hard questions had to be answered, where he could be the man who tried, without ever being the one who truly showed up. Some evenings, I'd find him in the garage again, not cleaning this time, just sitting in the car with the engine off. His fingers would trace the steering wheel, eyes distant, maybe imagining life after me, maybe imagining how he'd retell this chapter. She got sick. I did what I could. He had already written my ending, but I had changed the plot. I was healing, quietly, not in dramatic leaps, but in steady, unseen ways. I felt breath returning to places where silence once lived. I could walk a little farther now without gripping the railing. I could sleep without fear of waking in the dark, my lungs gasping for air. But I didn't tell him. I let him plan. Let him gently put away my shoes from the hallway, stack my books like memorials. He had started saving voicemail messages. I've noticed the blinking light on the landline more often now. Messages are never deleted, as if he were archiving my voice. There was a mercy in letting him stay blind to the miracle. Because had he known, he might have tried to come close again. He might have wanted access to what was rising in me. And this time, I wasn't going to hand that over to someone who only showed up when the ending felt safe. He didn't mourn the woman I was. He mourned the version of me that had always made him comfortable. The quiet one. The dependent one. The one who looked up to him for things he never truly gave. And in his sadness, he still missed me. Because even as he prepared to lose me, he never saw who I had become. Have you ever had to choose peace over people? It was raining that night, softly and steadily, not dramatically. The kind of rain that doesn't stop a plan, just asks you to walk through it with purpose. I arrived early, coat still damp, papers tucked inside my bag like a second spine. The table was small and private, tucked into a quiet corner of a restaurant that didn't mind lingering. I ordered tea. No lemon, just warmth. And I waited. My lawyer arrived right on time, Ms. Greer. Calm, intelligent eyes, the kind of woman who could deliver devastating news with grace or power with precision. She greeted me not like a client, but like a woman who had found her footing. I slid the envelope across the table. Not dramatic, just necessary. "These are the changes," I said, my voice steady. She nodded and opened the file. Inside were the revised beneficiary forms, the updated power of attorney, and the trust documents with new names in clean print. Not his. Never again his. Instead, the community clinic that never turned me away when insurance failed. My goddaughter. 2 women I met in group therapy who were trying to finish school while battling the same diagnosis I had survived. And of course, Aunt Louise's scholarship fund for girls who had been told they asked for too much just by existing. Ms. Greer read through them with quiet reverence, only pausing once. "Are you absolutely sure?" she asked. "I've never been more," I said. "It's not about anger. It's about accuracy." She smiled. "Then we'll file first thing in the morning. It will be final by the end of the week." We didn't toast. This wasn't that kind of celebration. But there was a silence between us that hummed with understanding. I wasn't rewriting history. I was correcting the record. When dinner came, we talked like old friends, about books, about women who raised themselves, about the ways we give too much before we know what we're worth. At one point, Ms. Greer looked at me and said, "You didn't just take back your name. You took back your narrative." And I realized she was right. I had entered that dinner as someone he still assumed was his responsibility, a woman tethered to sickness and need. I left it as a woman who had written her own ending, one signature at a time. Later that night, I stood in front of the mirror and said it out loud. My full name. First, middle, last. The one my mother gave me before anyone else ever tried to change it. It sounded different now. Not like a name I was trying to keep alive, but one I was ready to carry forward. That night, I didn't rehearse what I'd say when he found out. I didn't imagine his face or his silence. I didn't need to. Because this chapter wasn't for him. It was for the girl who once whispered her worth and finally said it out loud. It wasn't a dramatic meeting. No slamming doors, no raised voices. Just the kind of silence that builds when truth is about to take its seat at the table. She had asked me not to come, said she preferred to let the documents speak for themselves. I understood. Some truths carry more weight when spoken by someone else, someone who isn't trying to be loved through the telling. So I waited in the conference room, a neutral space softened by plants in 2 small pots, and one painting of a lake that never changed seasons. He arrived 5 minutes late, phone in hand, still checking emails like he wasn't about to lose his balance. My lawyer introduced herself. He sat. She pulled the file from my briefcase slowly, not for effect, but for precision. This was the kind of delivery that had to be measured, not softened. "This meeting is to inform you of changes made to your wife's estate," she began. He blinked, confused. "Estate?" She nodded once. "As of last week, your wife finalized updates to her will, trust, and beneficiary assignments. The assets named within the documents are substantial. She requested I make you aware of them formally." She laid the summary sheet before him. Line by line, asset by asset. Real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and dividend-bearing stocks. A quiet empire, all cataloged in clean rows. And then, at the bottom, the part that shifted the room's air. "You are not listed as a beneficiary," she said plainly. He didn't respond right away. just stared at the paper like it had betrayed him. Then he looked up. "You're saying she owns all this?" "Yes." "And she didn't tell me?" "She had no obligation to." I watched it happen, his shoulders sinking, fingers tightening around the chair arm. His world wasn't spinning, just his perception of who she had been. He tried to speak, failed, tried again. "She made all these decisions, without me?" "She made them to protect what she built," she said. His mouth parted like he wanted to argue, but no words came. Not because he didn't have them, because nothing he could say would change the paper in his hands. He finally looked up at her. "Why are you the one telling me this?" "She thought you'd hear it more clearly this way." He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. She gathered the remaining documents and slid them into a folder. "If you have questions, I'm available to answer them. But the decisions are final." He didn't nod, didn't move, just sat there, a man rearranging the puzzle of someone he thought he knew. And I understood. Because she hadn't just changed her will. She'd changed the story he felt he was written into. "You mean she was worth?" He didn't move for a long time. Just sat there, hunched slightly, holding the paper like it might dissolve if he blinked too hard. His lips moved once or twice, but no sound came. It was the look of a man realizing the ground beneath him had shifted, and that it had been shifting for far longer than he'd cared to notice. She waited, not out of pity, out of respect for the moment. He finally looked up, voice low, almost hoarse. "You mean she was worth all that?" There was no sarcasm in his tone, no bitterness, just bewilderment. Like the word worth had never belonged to her before now. "Yes," she said simply. "She was." He stared at the numbers again. His finger traced one of the totals, like he was trying to feel the reality through the ink. But she never acted like it. She folded my hands calmly. "That's because your definition of wealth never had room for her." He looked up quickly. A flicker of defensiveness crossed his face, then faded just as fast. "She was always asking for things," he said quietly. "Help, support." I thought he trailed off. "I thought if she had something, I'd have known." "She didn't build it for you to know," she replied. "She built it because no one else would." He sat back, eyes clouded. "I thought she was weak." "She let you think that," I said. "Sometimes survival looks like weakness when you're not the one living it." The silence stretched. Then quietly, "Was this always her plan? To leave me out?" "No," I said. "This wasn't punishment. It was protection." She realized who truly saw her and who didn't. He nodded slowly, still not quite looking at her. Then, with more desperation than he likely intended, he asked, "Did she say anything? About me?" She reached into her briefcase, pulled out a small sealed envelope. "She wrote you a letter," she said. "Said it was the only explanation she owed you." He didn't take it right away, just stared at it like it was too light to carry the weight it now held. "It's not long," she added, "but it's honest." He finally reached for it. His hand trembled slightly. She gathered the rest of my things. "I'll leave you with that." As she stood to go, he asked one more time, barely above a whisper, "So she really was worth millions?" She paused at the door, then said what needed saying. "She was always worth more than you ever measured." And then she left him there, still holding the letter, still searching the silence for the woman he'd finally begun to see, only after she'd stopped needing to be seen. "You always said I was quiet. You never realized I was listening. And when I stopped asking you to see me, it wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. By the time you're holding this letter, you'll already know. The numbers, the properties. The fact that the woman you thought was clinging to survival had been building something stronger than silence, something that didn't need your approval to exist. But I didn't do it for revenge. That's what you'll probably think. I left you out to punish you, that I kept things hidden out of spite, that all this was one long strategic silence. But the truth is, it wasn't that at all. I did it to protect the version of me you never saw, the one who stopped begging to be believed, the one who paid for her own treatment while you bought new shoes, the one who stopped crying and started investing. And when I stopped telling you things, it wasn't because I wanted to hurt you. It was because you didn't hear me when I was whispering, and you weren't listening when I was screaming inside. You loved me when I was smaller than you. You were comfortable when I leaned, when I asked, when I hesitated. But when I grew into myself, you stepped back, as if my becoming was a threat. And maybe it was. Maybe power looks like betrayal when it's no longer yours to control. But again, this isn't about revenge. It's about reflection. You looked at me every day and didn't see what was becoming of me. You lay next to someone who was learning to breathe again, slowly, painfully, and never once asked what it cost her to keep going. That kind of ignorance isn't evil. It's just careless. But I couldn't afford to be careless with what I was building. So I got quiet. And then I got smart. And then I got free. I didn't write this letter to gloat. I wrote it because I know you'll sit with the lawyer's words and wonder who I really was. This is who I was. A woman who stayed too long, hoping to be seen. A woman who stopped waiting. A woman who, in the quiet, found her own name again. And yes, I left you out of the will. But I didn't do it out of hate. I did it because I finally understood that the life I'm leaving behind was never built on partnership. It was built on performance. I was the one performing. And I've stopped. I hope in time, you will see this not as punishment, but as permission. To look again. At me. At yourself. At the space between the life we shared and the truth you refused to face. Because I wasn't worth millions, I was always priceless. And now, I know it too. The last time I saw him, he stood at the doorway like he might say something. Like maybe all the weight of everything he'd finally learned would translate into one clean sentence. But words don't come easily when silence has been your language for years. He held the letter in his hand, creased now, read more than once. I could tell by the way his thumb lingered at the bottom fold. Maybe he was still hoping there'd be more written beneath my signature. Something softer. Something that left the door cracked open. But there wasn't. I had said everything I needed to say. Not to be heard, but to be finished. I walked past him slowly, keys in hand, shoulders straight. Not with pride, but with peace. Not the loud kind that demands to be noticed, but the quiet kind that no longer waits for permission to exist. He didn't stop me. Not with a word. Not with a gesture. And that told me more than anything ever could. Because the truth is, he was never going to understand. Not what it cost me to stay. Not what it took to leave. Not the worth I carried long before I ever found the paperwork to prove it. But that's the thing about worth. It isn't validated by recognition. It doesn't wait for applause. It doesn't grow because someone finally sees it. It grows because you do. I got in the car, took one last look at the house we used to call home, and exhaled. There was no grief in it, no nostalgia, just release. Behind me were years of shrinking to fit, of softening my voice, of trading clarity for compromise. But ahead was space, breath, a life designed with room for all the parts of me I used to hide. He'll tell the story differently, I'm sure. Maybe he'll say I kept secrets. Maybe he'll call it betrayal. But what he won't say, what he can't admit, is that I only stopped telling him things after he stopped listening. And in the end, it doesn't matter. Because I know now, you don't have to know my worth for me to have it. You don't have to agree for me to move. You don't have to understand for me to bloom. I drove without music, windows down, letting the wind carry off whatever pieces of me still thought I needed closure. I didn't. Some stories don't need a neat ending, just a strong exit. And mine? Mine was silent, certain, and whole. He may never look at me and see an empire, but I walk like one now, and I'll never be poorer for what I left behind. He didn't call. Not right away. Not after the letter. Not even after the silence stretched wide enough to swallow the years between us. But I knew he'd read it more than once. I could feel it. Some truths don't land with a crash. They settle, slow, like dust after a demolition. They don't need your attention. They demand it. 3 days passed, then 4, then a week. I expected a message, a paragraph, even a late night, just explain it to me. But there was nothing. And that, strangely, was a kind of peace. Because I knew then, he had finally let go of the version of me he'd always held on to. The soft, quiet woman who would always come back to explain her dignity in gentler terms. She no longer existed. He understood that now. I heard from a friend that he went back to the lawyer, not to fight, but to ask if the letter had really come from me. If I'd truly written those words. If the woman who once begged for small kindnesses could now walk away from millions with her spine intact. The lawyer told him yes. I imagine he sat with that for a long time. I imagine he replayed every moment, every dismissal, every refusal to help, every time he'd used his wallet as a throne. Maybe he remembered the night he asked, "Why would you even need that much?" And now, he had the answer. Not just in numbers, but in the way I had walked away whole. There's something about knowing someone moved on, not out of rage, but out of recognition. It humbles you. It silences the ego. And if you're willing, it wakes the soul. He still didn't reach out. And I didn't expect him to. Because what was left to say? He had finally learned that silence, when chosen, is power. And when endured, it is a consequence. I imagine he keeps the letter somewhere now. Maybe tucked into the same drawer where he keeps the receipts of a life that didn't quite go the way he thought it would. He lost me long before the lawyer stepped in, long before the checkbook and the diagnosis and the will. He lost me the day he stopped seeing the gold in my presence and started measuring me by what I cost. So no, I didn't need an apology. I didn't need a phone call or a reconciliation. What I needed was already mine: distance, peace, and the unshakable joy of knowing I'd built something beautiful and walked away before it destroyed me. And even now, with everything he knows, he still doesn't know how much it took to leave quietly. But I do, and I'll never forget it. Healing isn't always loud. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand declarations. It won't kick the door down or demand a witness. More often, it looks like a quiet drive away from the life that once convinced you to doubt your own reflection. A slow turning of the key. A long, deep breath. The decision to leave, not with anger, but with clarity. She didn't leave to prove a point. She left because she finally understood. You don't have to stay where you aren't seen to be real. You don't have to shrink to be safe. You don't have to be chosen to be enough. The wealth she carried wasn't just in the trust funds or the inheritance. It wasn't in the real estate, the dividends, or the final check that bore her name alone. It was in every decision she made when no one was clapping. Every morning, she got up and chose dignity instead of drama. Every breath she took without asking permission to keep breathing. She had learned that peace is the final word, that revenge was too small a thing to chase, that true freedom is louder than any apology that comes too late. And the most powerful part? She never needed anyone to validate what she already knew. Because when a woman remembers her worth, the world doesn't need to clap. She does not return. She does not explain again. She does not reopen doors that once required her to beg. She simply lives, richer in spirit, fuller in purpose, and softer in the places that once ached. She learns that softness isn't weakness, it's strength without armor. That boundaries are a love letter to your own becoming. That silence is sometimes the most powerful testimony of survival. He will keep the questions, the ifs, the whys, the how did I miss it? He'll hold them late at night like puzzle pieces to a picture he never bothered to finish. But she? She took the answers with her. Not out of spite, but because they were never his to hold. He might tell the story differently. He might say she gave up, that she changed, that she walked away too easily. But what he won't say, what he'll never say, is that he watched her suffocate in the silence and still expected her to stay. That when she needed air, he bought himself comfort. That when she asked for help, he measured her worth by the size of the bill. So now, she doesn't argue. She doesn't defend her choices. She doesn't try to make him understand, because understanding was never the requirement for liberation. The woman she is now walks with memory, yes, but not with regret. She knows now that survival isn't the goal. Wholeness is. And wholeness comes with walking away from things that refuse to grow with you. She walks differently now. Not heavier, lighter. Not careful, certain. Because knowing her worth no longer depends on someone else's recognition. It lives in the way she rises, the way she chooses softness without surrender, the way she builds without broadcasting, the way she no longer asks for space, she claims it. She didn't slam the door. She didn't shout. She didn't count the years she lost. She counted the steps she took back to herself. Because some stories don't end with vengeance, they end with vision. Some women don't roar. They remember. And they write again. He thought she was walking away with millions. But what she really took with her was peace, was power, was herself. And with every step forward, she writes a new story. One where love doesn't cost her everything, and knowing her worth is the wealth that never runs out. No, the world didn't spin when she left. But something inside her did. And it will never turn back again. Thank you for being here. Her journey was heavy, but it led her back to herself. Watch another powerful story by clicking on the left, and don't forget to subscribe for more voices that deserve to be heard.